Let me also welcome and introduce here Alex Stubb, our great friend, Director of School of Transnational Governance, European University Institute, who is also the former Prime Minister of Finland, Minister of Finance, Foreign Minister, Trade and Europe Minister of Finland. So he has been also recently Vice President of European Investment Bank, and we are very happy that he agreed to moderate this discussion in the course of this 1 hour. We are really in the midst of a great crisis, not only for Europe, but for the world. And by far, this is not only a health crisis. This is a multidimensional crisis that will transform our international institutions, our security, our economies, and many other dimensions of our lives. And it is definitely a test for the European Union. And we know that European Union in the past was stronger. During the crisis, it always came up stronger. When we've seen the crisis 10 years ago, we never thought that we would be able to integrate so closer as we did. So what will affect, how will affect this crisis, the European Union, the Slovak foreign policy? Will this be a crisis where the European Union will be stronger at the end? Or it will be fragmented, divided on East and West and North and South, etc. So this will be a very interesting discussion. So let me again welcome all of you, and let me pass the floor to Alex Stubb.
Yes, thank you very much, Robert, and good afternoon, good morning to all of you. It's really nice to join you. I always enjoy being linked somehow to Bratislava because Finland won the World Championships in ice hockey there in 2011 and 2019. So it's a very special place, right. A very special place for us. It's also a wonderful opportunity to link again with Ivan Korčok. And let me just begin by congratulating you and also actually congratulating Slovakia. You will know that I was a foreign minister in my olden days and had a bit of a link to the Finnish diplomatic service as well. I find it admirable that Slovakia has always been able to be blessed with very professional diplomat foreign ministers. You know, I remember Edward Kukan, I remember Jan Kubis, Miro Lajčák, Mikuláš Dzurinda, and many others. And now to have you with your background as having been, you know, US ambassador, German ambassador, you were in the convention, you've been negotiating NATO accession, you've been EU perm rep. I mean, it just doesn't get much better than that. And this is what is going to make our discussion so interesting today. And I'll just begin by asking you a very general question to give you the opportunity to make some introductory remarks. And the general question is, what is the COVID situation in Slovakia at the moment?
Well, thank you, Alex, and I thank all who are joining us, and first of all, those who are co-organizing this webinar and offering me this opportunity to share my views with you, with the audience across Europe, as I have heard. In addition to those who Robert has mentioned already and thanked them for this, I'd like to thank him and Slovak GLOBSEC. As you know, this is a famous Slovak platform which has developed so hugely and greatly over the last years, and every year they're bringing, you know, leaders from around the world, and we are so proud of having GLOBSEC in Central Europe. Too many thanks to you, Alex, for flattering words. To hear them from former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, it's very, very encouraging. And two, I'm glad to see my friend Hans-Dietmar Schweisgut. We've met when I studied in Brussels 2009, so friends are now on the screen, and I'm so pleased to see you. How is the situation? Just to get straight into your question, it is very good when it comes to the health situation. I belong to those who have always resisted sort of tendency to, you know, to make a race from how we have been dealing with it. But it is true that Slovakia is on top when it comes to the number of people who were infected and those who died. And I I did my mathematics before to make a comparison, a benchmark. So Slovakia is, I mean, population-wise, as Finland, 5.5 million roughly, and we have had 283 infected persons per 1 million. Finland has had 1,200, and Austria, I think, 6 or 7 times more than Slovakia. It doesn't make sense to make those comparisons, but at the end of the day, what matters is that Slovakia has managed this challenge in order to protect our people, thanks to the measures that we have adopted at very, very early stage. And they were very controversial, let me say that. But thanks to them, at the end of the day, I think we've managed to control and confine basically the territory. But we closed the airport very early when others have still left their airports open. People have been criticizing the government for that, but it paid off. And I think now we have removed practically all measures inside the country. We are moving. The cross-border mobility works already. An hour after we finish here, I'm traveling to Vienna to meet my colleagues from neighboring countries, where we basically are going to celebrate a little bit because we can see each other in person, but to look ahead at what can be done, you know, when it comes to the upcoming vacation, because Slovaks want to travel south, Slovenia, Croatia, they will be crossing Austria. So all in all, good. And I'll stop my intro by saying, but this is, let's say, something we got over very well, but immediately we are re-entering, or we are finding ourselves in a huge challenge that all countries of Europe are facing, namely how to manage and how to face the post-COVID economic crisis, which is already here, and the figures, I can share them with you later on, are not very rosy when it comes to my country. So that's my intro. But I'm ready if you're interested more in the new government. I'm ready to.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Ivan. Much appreciated. Let me jump on the idea of neighbors there. I had the opportunity to interview your colleague and my good longtime friend, Alexander Schallenberg, who also has a diplomatic background, much like yourself. And one of the big theses that he threw out was that, you know, if you're looking for a silver lining of COVID-19, is to say that relations with neighbors have become closer than ever. What's your sentiment and feeling on that? I know it's only a half an hour drive from Bratislava to Vienna, but how much contact have you had with your closest neighbors?
Well, this is perfect question, and I'm so glad you've mentioned my friend Alexander Schallenberg, because he was in fact the first person I contacted, because the audience may not know, but it was so difficult for me to leave Washington and participate in a swearing-in ceremony of the government, which I have missed because of my inability to travel from Washington. But thanks to Austria, they took me on board of their repatriation flight, the last one from Washington to Vienna, and then a week later I was named foreign minister. But I'm mentioning that because when I spoke with him for the first time, he said, this is the moment where we understand the value of neighborhood and good relationship around, which, you know, in a previous time when we have not been sufficiently aware of this value of neighborhood, we could travel. In fact, we have not realized anymore that still matters what he says, die Nachbarschaft zählt. So the neighborhood matters at this moment. And you're right, it was exactly what our citizens expected from us, that it is the closest partners to us. In our case, it was Austria, it was Czech Republic, it was Hungary and Poland, where we naturally were. It was not only a choice, but it was a need to naturally reach out to our partners across the border. And in fact, I remember days when I was twice on phone with Alexander or with Peter Szijjártó from Hungary, because people were pushing us. Every morning we've received hundreds of calls from our citizens, and they've been asking, how can we commute to Austria. And in the first phase, you know, it was difficult to tell them, well, this is not possible, but still we had to allow, you know, transport of goods and essential stuff across the border. So the long story short is the neighborhood still matters, and especially in these crisis situations. And they were my closest partners, and I'm so glad. This afternoon we're going to meet in Vienna. It's 4 countries: Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, and Slovenia. And we're going to have a good discussion. And at the end, of course, we'll visit one of the Heurigen in order to have a glass of wine to chill out the day there. So that was important. Yeah.
That sounds extremely good. How about your sentiment? I mean, given that you came directly from Washington, I mean, how would you compare not so much Slovakia and the US, but the response in Europe versus the response in the United States? What's your sort of feeling on that?
Yeah, well, I've been receiving this question from day one since I returned from the United States, and I remember that moment when I was leaving already. I will never forget the picture, you know, on the airport, because there was nobody, just us. It was completely empty, the airport in Washington already. But just a few days before, when we went out with my wife just to say goodbye to the city, you know, there was normal life, but there was not a single one person, just 1 week before we were leaving, wearing a mask. 2 weeks before that, we were in New York, when we in Europe already knew, I think, it was sort of recognized reality in Europe that something bad is going to happen and we have to change our life for at least for a certain period of time. That type of recognition has not existed in the United States. And I knew in that moment when we were in New York, before we finally left the United States, it's gonna be very, very difficult. Then I think we need more time. Americans will need more time just to digest what happened in that country. But I understand it as a sort of expression of American soul, you know, that for them to imagine that they cannot move freely on the street. It was the recipe in the initial phase. That was the recipe to limit mobility, to limit the freedom we were used to. What was unthinkable. And then we see that even in such a country like the United States, which is a sophisticated, high-tech country, but it is this type of crisis, health crisis, unseen before, is testing everything, the infrastructure, institutions within even such developed countries like the United States. And I'm so sorry, that's my final remark, that so many people had to pay with their lives in the United States, because they're the most cases in the United States, both when it comes to infected and those who died of COVID. But this is a strong nation. I can tell you, we all know the United States. They will get over it.
Yeah, definitely very resilient. But that, I guess, one of the big arguments, and I'm much like yourself, an avid transatlanticist, was that many of us were worried, you know, when the freedom of Joe Sixpack on the street in the United States is somehow limited, then I think there's often a reaction. And of course, with COVID, because it's a health crisis and there's not a public healthcare system, that has posed a challenge. And,
right.
and of course, if we look at the beginning, the way in which the president of the United States was dealing with the crisis was not necessarily, how would I say, by the book, as one would say.
But what comes,
go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you, Alex, but what comes to my mind, on the one hand, I remember the moment, as I was saying, where, you know, there was not this awareness as I've seen already in Europe in the initial phase, but remember that the United States has closed the air traffic I think much earlier than with it in Europe. There was, you know, again, a negative, and rightly so negative reaction in Europe over the, you know, so-called unilateral decision that the United States administration has taken not to allow us Europeans to enter, I mean, Schengen countries especially. But then we followed, and I think the measures that we have taken at the end of the day collectively as a European Union to limit the entry for those from outside of the EU, that was extremely important. But the first step, which I think end of January sometimes, or beginning of February, that was received as or perceived as a controversial one, at least in Europe, I know.
Yeah, I remember I actually reacted to that in the same way as well, and I'm pretty much thinking that, you know, this is it's sort of it was not a very wise unilateral move. History will, you know, make the judgment at the end of the day. Right. I just wanted the audience to know that feel free to pose questions. They will be moderated to me through the chat, I hope, and I can put them forward to Ivan. And also you should know that we have in stock here in about 10-15 minutes, Ambassador Hans Dietmar Schweizgut, Secretary General of the Austro-French Centre for Rapprochement in Europe, who will be commenting as well. Ivan, let me ask you, how did you feel about the initial European reaction and how we have been basically acting, I'd say pretty much since the beginning of March? Would you give the EU a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or somewhere in between?
Yeah. Well, thumb up, not for the very initial reaction, of course not. Maybe I'll make 2 points here. Number one, of course, in the first phase, it was a traditional response of the European institutions, if you want, and mainly European Commission, because I know how it works. They look into the sort of legal basis and what competence Europe is, and this is a very logical, rational approach, and therefore the very first day, that was the first instinct, if you want, that came from Brussels. Well, don't close the borders because, you know, you limit the freedom and internal market and that kind of stuff. So I would, without going into too much of details, they needed a time basically to look at the crisis and understand this is unprecedented. We cannot simply confine our action into just what legally we can do, but Europe had to act politically. And I am the one who, from the very beginning, has been vigorously denying the simplified view that Europe has failed. Of course, it took a time for Europe and European Union. But we can say the same of us, the member states. It took us a while on the national level to understand what we can do. And then I think after the institutions have recognized that they do have a role, I think then they acted very quickly. In the first initial phase, you know, they mobilized money. They allowed the green corridors in order to allow trucks with goods passing the borders which are closed. So I believe, once again, that time was needed for them to identify the role, but then it worked, and of course now it's decisive, and I think we will have a chance to talk for a few minutes about the response which is now projected and put on the table, because without Europe we will not manage the consequence, or to deal with the consequence of this crisis. So, and second point, you know, obviously we have lost a little bit in a battle of narratives, both within our countries and then globally. You know what I mean? That immediately, you know, many who see, per definition, European Union critically as unable to act in those kind of situations, they say, well, Europe has failed, while others have been saving us because from other countries they've been with pleasure delivering planes full of masks, and you know what I mean. So, well, but this is over, and once again, I think the European institutions have taken the lessons, and at the end of the day, we have to be distinctive when we describe what Europe has done, could have done, or has not done at all. And two, critically recognize that we member states, it was very difficult for us to deal with that situation as well.
Yeah, I think you're spot on that, and also for our viewers, it's always, I think, quite healthy to remind people that if we look at the euro crisis, it took pretty much 4 years to set up the European Stability Mechanism, and that one had a total bazooka of, say, 400 billion euros, roughly speaking, and now it took 4 weeks basically to get our act together, and it's probably the most rapid reaction that the European Union has ever had. And if you look at the 5 pillars, you know, number 1, the ECB's TEP program, number 2, the EIB's loan program to SMEs, you know, number 3, the ESM conversion, number 4, the Commission's Sure and Trust program. And now the recovery plan, the European Union is basically put together a package of roughly 3 trillion euros, and that's kind of unheard of. But this sort of gives a good bridge to my next question, and that's the MFF and how Slovakia is going to approach this whole package, and what kind of a line you're going to take on this.
Yeah, thank you for that. This is the issue we are going to deal with in coming days and months, maybe, because I mean, MFF and the top up on it, the Next Generation EU. This is, I think, the response which should help us deal with the economic consequences. Now, I'm looking forward to those difficult negotiations, because I had a chance to negotiate the previous one. Then during presidency, I negotiated with the Parliament and the Council the midterm review. But I have put down for me on a paper in preparing for this 3 characteristics of what is on the table right now, and it's a rather belletristic, less technical description how I see it. So first, it's unthinkable and unprecedented what is on the table. Number 2, potentially it boosts political integration, and therefore it could be controversial. And number 3, it's a very risky undertaking. So unthinkable, unprecedented, potentially boosting political integration, and very risky. And I'll try within 3 minutes to explain why I have chosen those 3 characteristics. Why unthinkable and unprecedented? Just remember that when the heads of state convened for the first time and tried to agree traditional MFF, multi-annual financial framework, that was before Corona, and they have not agreed on it. And basically the dispute was of traditional nature, net payers and net receivers, we fighting for cohesion policy and agricultural policy, and then the greening economy, how costly that will be. So that kind of usual stuff. And of course, when it comes to the volume, the debate was whether we go below a little bit, 1% of GDP, or we will be somewhere between what the Commission has proposed and what Charles. And we have not had an agreement on it. That was the first time that there was not an agreement on it, a traditional dispute. And then Corona comes. We understand that this is something where we have to respond boldly. And we are confronted with something on the table, which means not 1.08, 1.11, but 2% of GDP. And what is on top of it is really unprecedented when it comes to the whole philosophy and the structure. So from my experience over the last 15 years in European Union, this is yet another example that crises, as we have seen them over the last 10, 15 years, are producing a situation where we in European Union have no other choice but to agree on something unprecedented and unthinkable. So when we are back with our backs already, against the wall, then something unthinkable is put on the table. Number 2, why it is potentially boosting political integration. Alex will know very well, Dietmar as well. But you know, one of the issues, and Alex especially because he was prime minister, he remembers the euro crisis and instruments that we put in place. You remember back then we have introduced both stricter fiscal framework, 6-pack, 2-pack, fiscal discipline, and so on and so on. And in addition, we have introduced something that the audience knows is called European semester, where basically the whole idea of European semester is finally do something with economic coordination, because European Monetary Union right now, monetary union is in Frankfurt. We have fiscal rules, relatively tight, but we are still lagging behind when it comes to our ability to coordinate economically, so the economic pillar. So we have introduced semester, and we have believed that that would be an incentive for countries to carry out structural reforms. Every year, we have been adopting country-specific recommendations, hoping that, you know, the Commission will draw them, the member states will adopt them, and we will make us more competitive and our economies more sustainable. But the argument has always been, I have tight fiscal rules and therefore I cannot carry out structural reforms. And now imagine, thanks to Corona, something is put on the table where we are going to raise money jointly, guarantee those money jointly in order to restructure our economies. Should this really happen, I believe this not only means that that Europe can help us with restructuring our economies, but this will be also a major step forward when it comes to European integration, because the incentive for it, that comes from our joint effort, whether we like it or not. And if we play it well together, this is a big chance. And number 3, why is it risky? We all know that when we agree on traditional financial perspective, our national parliaments have to go through a ratification process on national level with the so-called ceiling of own resources. Well, that's basically a capping which cannot be exceeded for European financial framework. But this year, we are going up from 1.4% to 2%, and we have to have 27 national parliaments ratifying basically this huge increase of own resources and basically the money that will be at the disposal in Brussels for the member states. Number 2, what surprises me a little bit is that there is such a silence. Not that I'm not happy over it, or not a big controversy over the fact that we are borrowing that money. So taboo is broken in a way. We are borrowing money together. We will guarantee for that money together. But the day when our taxpayers are going either way, paid back will come. And what I'm saying, that it surprises me a little bit that while we are extensively discussing the, so to say, the spending side of it, of the budget, we are not too much discussing what I find quite a controversial issue is the financing part of it. Raising money, paying the money back, we don't know, because there are 2 options for it. Either the states after 2028 send bigger checks to Brussels and increase their national contributions, or we will introduce something that we call new own resources. And I have said to my staff, and I'm saying that, please delete the word tax. Either plastic kind of stuff or carbon, whatever. So I believe this, at the end of the day, could be a very risky operation as well. But Slovakia will, and that's my final point, and I apologize for being a bit long on this, Slovakia will be constructive. We will have, I think, an open debate domestically about this financing part, because we are breaking taboo, raising money together, which should be paid back with something that we do not call tax, but it is tax. But we will be constructive, because this is something that we view as an incentive to modernize our economy, to green our economy, and to do finally something more with the digitalization. So that was a long contribution to this, but this is a very complex issue. And
no, I mean, I must say, Ivan, I've heard the MFF being explained, or the situation being explained eloquently by many, but I really, really like the three sort of issues and characteristics that you brought forward. And I hope that a lot of the embassy staff and ambassadors who seem to be active on our chat took careful note about the Slovakian position as well. And to think about it really in the big picture first, in other words, that it's unthinkable and unprecedented, I fully agree. Secondly, that this could potentially boost political integration, I fully agree. And thirdly, I think you're absolutely right that this is a risky endeavor as well, mainly because of the 27 national ratifications. But what I do feel is that the Commission has actually played this quite smartly or shrewdly, because just like you said, the basic message from them is, listen, we do everything that it takes at the moment. And then they suggest that, well, you don't have to pay it back until 2047. And as a matter of fact, you don't have to pay it back because we could start boosting the own resources. And in that sense, for all of those who have an institutional memory, remember that with the Delors package in the late 1980s, it was exactly the opposite. In other words, for the EU's budget to be boosted, member states had to give in their own GDP per capita based payments rather than using own resources. And now they're doing the opposite. And I do think, you know, when we're talking about probably the most successful integrated unit in the world, it does have to have a slightly bigger budget than what it has right now. And if this then ends up bringing it up to, say, you know, 2% fairly permanently, and that being financed half by the member states, half by the own resources, that's good. And I was also glad to hear about the constructive and open approach that Slovakia has. At this stage, if you'd allow me, Ivan, I'd like to bring in Dietmar to give his views and observations on your intervention, and then I'll start picking some of the questions which I have seen here coming in on the chat.
All right.
So Dietmar, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Alexander. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sure can.
Yeah,
well,
thank you.
First of all, Ivan, congratulations on your new position. I'm so happy to see you as Foreign Minister of Slovakia. And let me also say how impressed I was by sort of the coherence and the cogent argumentation. And I think, you know, I would say it a bit in the same way when you described the initial reaction by the EU Commission, and it took a while. I think we should not forget also that there are certain things which are extremely difficult to do at the federal level in a federal state, let alone in an institutional setup like the European Union. Simply unthinkable to have a lockdown ordered from Brussels. That's something you need the national legitimacy. And I think for me, the important thing also was that with a few exceptions, of course, we were acting at different speeds. And you explained well how efficiently Slovakia was addressing this, the Slovak Republic. But the important thing was, and that is maybe a bit underestimated, that there was the fire brigade came in very early also at the European level. The ECB was instrumental, and I think this is still a legacy and a lesson learned from the financial crisis, that on the monetary side, we now have the instruments, the means to react very quickly to forestall sort of a major crisis. And then very quickly indeed came the instruments at the disposal of the European Union and also on the legal side, the competition policy, state aid, etc. So I think this acting together with what member states did and what was done at the European level after the initial difficulties you explained, well, that happened. It was also complemented, I think, by bilateral relations, and you mentioned the importance of the neighborhood activities. But then, of course, what I think is the most important part, Alexander was mentioning that it took 4 years until we came up with ESM, etc., during the financial crisis, sort of building up the architecture of the Eurozone, not complete yet, but still sort of much different from what it was before 2008. And the difference now, I think, is that I do believe you mentioned the potential impetus for political integration. But it's also, I think, quite interesting to note how from the very early stages where, for instance, Italy felt left alone and where anti-European sentiment was rising, this sentiment seemed to me to have turned fairly quickly with the Commission package to one of using also sort of a newly gained feeling of solidarity. Of course, you mentioned the risks, and that is, I think, the big issue. Will this feeling that we have to do something together outlast sort of the discussions we will all have at national levels, where national interests, of course, will play out, and where some of the same arguments we had in the discussion on the MFF before Corona started, will they resurface and sort of take precedence over what is not only sort of the solidarity part, but also the opportunity to invest jointly into a number of European future technologies and also facilitate the transition to the green economy. For me, sort of this question is also a bit linked to, do you think ministers, heads of state and government also see this as an opportunity to build the basis for going back to a discussion which we had at the beginning of the von der Leyen Commission, namely the quest for a more geopolitical Europe? Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Ivan, go ahead and take that. I'll come back with the next one.
Thank you. Thank you, Dietmar. So straight to your question, whether heads of states do view it as a chance, basically, to do more. I can speak on behalf of Slovak government, and with a clear answer, yes. But frankly, at the same time, we are under huge time pressure, meaning that we need sufficient time in order to set up our own national plan with which we want to implement and spend money that comes and that we will borrow wisely. And number two, and I think Alex will, as a former prime minister, will confirm that another controversial issue in it is, can we actually draw just within a few months something that we call at the end of the day structural reform, meaning that structural reforms, which in case of Slovakia, but I think other countries as well, are long overdue, but they are only of structural nature if they really bring about a change in a country and they cause a pain, including social pain, including shortage of money that you need in order to fund those structural reforms. And I'm asking myself, I'll be asking those questions in Brussels. The whole paradigm, basically, to provide an incentive for countries to carry out structural reform is right. But is it really achievable to draw those structural reforms just within 6 months? And is it realistic to implement those reforms in a fast-tracked structure as the recovery fund is designed, because there I see sort of a risk, or maybe something that many in Slovakia will call very bluntly a moral hazard, because we have not been restructuring our economies, I mean, generally in Europe, in peace times. Now we are expected to first borrow money in debt future generations, because it will be our kids who will be paying back for that. And how can we make sure that what we spend that money for is really going to restructure our economies? And number two, I don't want to see a result where at the end, those who are, I think, called, the famous frugals, they will basically achieve their goals through slashing down the traditional part, namely multi-annual financial framework, because that will mean at the end of the day less contributions from national level, because in countries like Slovakia, it can only be carried out at the expense of traditional policies like cohesion and agriculture policy. And then we have a problem how to sell it back in Slovakia and get the ratification through the parliament. So all in all, Dietmar, absolutely yes. I finished my intro on MFF. Indeed, we see it as a huge chance, but there are many, many question marks, and we need to have clarity on those issues, because there is a moral hazard. I keep on saying that. Unless we get this right, unless we underpin, those sort of structural reforms with legislative framework being adopted in our countries, and that's going to be a very difficult process, then there is a risk that money will be raised, our debt will go up one day, but there will not be the change on the ground, which actually is the objective that I hope we all are following primarily.
I think that, Ivan, leads me quite comfortably to the next question, and I'm wondering, I'm looking at Robert here, whether we can get Antonio Villafranca from ISPI Milan to pose his question live, whether that's technically possible, because he had a question about the compromise on the recovery fund. So I'll just give it a few seconds. So go for it, Antonio Villafranca, if you're still there.
Yes, here I am. I wonder if you can hear me.
Yes,
thank you very much for
sure
this
can.
opportunity. Thank you very much for this. I'm the research coordinator at IFRI, which is the oldest Italian think tank based in Milan. Well, in 3 days, Minister Korčok, we have the European Council, and in Italy we are all wondering whether a compromise, will be reached during this European Council, or whether it is more likely to have a compromise to strike a deal in July. And in particular, my question for you is whether you consider the compromise will be in terms of lowering the amount of the recovery fund from 750 to 500, for instance, as apparently Germany is proposing over the last 2 weeks, and whether you think another part of the compromise will be on the instruments which will be used, whether we are going to have grants or loans. So this is my question for you. Thank you for your ability.
Well, I wish I knew, but I dare say that I can barely imagine that we can get an agreement, so to say, at the end of this week. Do not underestimate still the mere fact that this is not going to be a real negotiations. It's still the video sort of conference where prime ministers are not meeting in person. And from my experience, Dietmar's experience, Alex's experience, you know how the deals are being made. At the end, you need a personal contact. You need to understand, especially when it comes to critical and controversial issues, you need to break it down to smaller groups, and then the lead of Charles Michel in this case. So I realistically exclude that we would get a deal now in a video conference. But I believe this video conference has to produce, or rather maintain, what I call a positive momentum, where basically we need to establish an agreement that, without having an agreement on the details, we agree on the philosophy. And I hope if we have this commitment of our heads leaving then their respective rooms in Rome and Slovakia and Helsinki and in Vienna, then that could be an opening for real negotiations, but they must take place in person. Later in July, I've been hearing that even two meetings could be scheduled for July, and then certainly certainly issues that you have raised, they will be on the table realistically, because I too almost exclude that the final outcome would be the outcome that we are having on the table, and there will be changes, maybe in a proportion between loans and grants in a top-up in a recovery fund. I hope once again the solution, and we have unanimity here, and I can say here online and publicly, Slovakia and other countries, we will not agree to the package as a whole once the two traditional policies should follow prey or become a victim of these negotiations within the MFF, which is the cohesion and agricultural policies. Two, I cannot at this moment judge or predict to what extent there will be debate about the financing part. You remember what I said 10 minutes ago. This is unthinkable. We are breaking taboo. We are raising money together, and we have to be clear, open, and very fair with our citizens that in 8 years later, we either will be sending more national contributions to repay, or we will introduce new own resources. And in that proposal, if I'm not mistaken, which is on the table right now, we do not have any specific proposal when it comes to what form of new own resources there should be. Just to consider, there are 3 of them, but what are the details? We don't know. So you have too many issues that are entirely open, but we first need to establish a big deal and agreement that the overall philosophy is something which would be acceptable, where we all, as it is at the end of the day, will be equally dissatisfied, because that's the logical outcome of it, of all these kind of negotiations. But from that point on, I think we must act responsibly, because be it Slovakia, Italy, Finland, nobody will make it on its own. I can say as well that Slovakia, when I said we will be a constructive partner, we are ready to look at it from a bit more European side, not only to see how much at the end of the day is in the Slovak envelope, because Slovakia is the most open economy in Europe. And we know that even if we don't get an ideal deal, the big portion of the bread that we are bringing back to Slovakia, but others get a bigger portion, but then it leads them to a faster recovery, the rest of Europe, then Slovak economy will benefit, because we need to increase the demand of economy to bring it back, because then it will be the customers around Europe who will be buying the cars that are being produced in Slovakia. So not only, once again, the ideal solution just for Slovakia, that's not enough anymore. We need to look at it what we get to Slovakia, but in addition, what kind of incentive that will be for the European economy as a whole.
Thank you very much, Ivan. The next question I have here is from Susanna Podrachka, and it's on Brexit. And I was wondering if Susanna is online and would like to pose the question herself, or whether you want me to read it out.
Yeah.
I can't hear Susanna, so therefore I'll read it out. She's actually asking that the UK has now confirmed that they will not extend the transition period. And so what's your view on the Brexit negotiations and the future of UK-EU relations, also with regards to V4 or Visegrad 4 specifically?
Well, I'll here, I mean, in difference to my previous lengthy interventions, I'll be very short. So fine, we've taken note of what our UK friends have announced recently. They're not ready to ask extension, that's fine. But we are not at the end of the negotiations. I mean, let me put it very, very bluntly. We still have time to get an agreement within the remaining period that is at our disposal until the end of this year. Number one, because the worst sort of kind of scenario would be no deal. No deal. So United Kingdom leaving at having for itself, but for us as well, something that we call a negotiated deal that will not be good for United Kingdom. I think it will be worse for them, but it will not be good for us, and it will not be good for Slovakia, where from the very beginning we've said that United Kingdom is leaving, but we want orderly conditions being agreed upon. So the only thing that I will say, fine, if this is the UK decision, we take note of it, but we still have to use the remaining time, because there is a lot of stakes. There are a lot of stakes in it for us to get a deal. I don't want to go beyond this.
Yeah. Good. Then we have a couple of questions linked to sort of security and enlargement and Eastern Partnership. We even have one question coming from Azerbaijan but perhaps you could sort of bundle these together, and sorry for not naming the people. I'm looking at my notes from the questions. The first one is to say, okay, what kind of implications does COVID have on security in Europe, broadly speaking? Second, what kind of implications does it have on enlargement? And thirdly, what kind of implications on Eastern Partnership? And I think this is probably the last batch of questions that we can take, because we have 5 minutes left.
Well, it will, but it will be reading from a crystal ball if I wanted to really come up with a very sophisticated and response. We don't know. We really don't know at this moment, but I can tell you it will impact, but to what extent will very much depend on how we Europeans, 27 of us, deal with the crisis, how we master that crisis, how we will be able to satisfy basically the expectations of our citizens, because I don't want to disappoint anybody here, but you would understand that at this moment, primarily, be it Finns, be it Austrians, be it Slovaks, Poles, and others, they first of all expect that their national governments deliver for themselves. That does not mean that we are giving up what we call, and I will vigorously support us Europeans, not to forget about our neighborhood. And our neighborhood is the Western Balkans. And I put it in a really broader context. Our neighborhood is Eastern neighborhood, where we have recently had a summit. And this is not only that we do something for those countries, but the Slovak position is that without offering to the countries in the Western Balkans a European perspective, which means membership, let me put it very bluntly, and without us offering a credible framework for our Eastern partners, where we see among 6 of them a clear differentiation. There are 3 countries who are more advanced, more ambitious, and then there are countries who are less ambitious, but it is European interest. So it's not that we are doing that something as a consolation prize to those countries, but we Europeans can never, ever have, how should I say it, be credible enough in the world unless we are able, to make an influence in our direct neighborhood. So enlargement has to continue. No doubt about it. And I think my colleague is here, but it's now when Albania and who else? And Northern Macedonia are reopening their accession talks. Great, I believe. Still, it will be merit-based approach, definitely, but neither enlargement nor our engagement with our neighbors must become a victim of whatever the outcome and impact of a COVID crisis. And I want to highlight certainly the Slovak perspective when it comes to Eastern neighbors, and this is Ukraine. I mean, there are 2 points here. Number one, we will never accept we will always support Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty. This is not a done deal that in the 21st century, all of a sudden one country loses part of its territory. I mean, this is unthinkable again. So we will never accept that. And number two, we will do our best, everything what we can to support Ukrainians' transformation, because I believe that's the best answer for Ukraine, for their citizens, and support as much as we can their free decision to see their future as a close partner with Europe. It all started 2014 there. I mean, with people wearing and waving European flags. This was the beginning of the conflict, nothing else.
I think that's an excellent point to end with. I was reminded when you supported Ukraine strongly, and I'm with you on that, your thesis on the MFF, that it's unthinkable, not unprecedented. I think on Ukraine, it was unthinkable, but unfortunately not unprecedented.
That's right.
We have seen that type of activity and aggression coming from Russia previously. I would also like to personally thank you in my new capacity as director of the School for Transnational Governance at the European University Institute for Slovakia actually becoming the latest member. You will know that the European University Institute was founded in the early 1970s and now has 24 members. And I think Slovakia joined in 2019. So it's great to have you guys on board. And please use and abuse us as much as you like in the future for training your academics, your civil servants, your civil society and private sector. We really look forward to cooperation with the Slovakian government and certainly also with GLOBSEC. With these words, I would like to hand it over to Robert and also thank Dietmar for his participation. So please, Robert, over to you to wrap it up.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I will be very quick to say that thank you for this very extraordinary discussion. I think it brought very clear insights how the Slovak government is thinking about Europe and how we want to shape or co-shape the future of the European Union, because we are also responsible how the European Union will look like. Thank you, Alex, for super moderation and for all the partners. And I apologize, we did not answer all the questions. I've seen there are dozens of questions on the chat. We would wish we would have more time, but I'm sure Minister is quite busy with meetings that are on his agenda today. But we hope we'll be able to meet many of you in person, and not only through Zoom, in one of the GLOBSEC forums and Tatra Summit that we are planning for October. Unfortunately, we had to postpone also our forum from May, but now we know, and we have fixed dates in the fall when we are organizing it on the 7th and 8th of October. So some of you, I hope we will be seeing in person, and we'll continue on the very important discussion on the future of Europe. So thank you very much once again, Mr. Minister, and finger crossed for your great leadership in Europe. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Ambassador Dietrich, and thanks to all of you who joined.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Everybody.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.